Buenas tardes. Good afternoon. My name is Peter Casarella, the Director of Latin American and North American Church Concerns, and I want to welcome you all here for this 20th anniversary event celebrating Ecclesia in America, the post-synodal apostolic exhortation of Pope John Paul II from January 22nd, 1999. I'm very pleased to see undergraduates here, and also want to thank the graduate students who are here. We have a very distinguished panel, and I just have some very, very brief and informal introductory remarks to get us going. Ecclesia in America, of course, is Latin for the Church in America, and what John Paul II did struck me when it was promulgated on January 22nd, 1999, as we say in Spanish, una maravilla. Almost a miracle. I was teaching at the time at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., and I was trying to find a way to think about collaboration between the Church in North America and Church in Latin America. And then this apostolic exhortation came out, and he used the phrase that there's one church in America, as we say in Spanish, in America. It's not two separate churches, but there's one church. And that was something as a source of wonder. And in fact, a lot of the course of my own kind of theological trajectory and career as a theologian has been inspired, if not by those very words, then something like it. And I'll give you some examples. When we were at Catholic U, I worked with the then president, Father David O'Connell, now the Bishop of Trenton, and a young priest, a Colombian priest who worked in the diocese, who brought some people from Latin America, Mario Dorsonville, now auxiliary bishop of Washington, D.C., Catholic U, a lot of bishops. If you know anything about the place, it would kind of fit the bill. And we did a discussion, not just about Ecclesia in America, but about this North-South dialogue, which is interesting because as a pontifical Catholic university, you'd think that there was more dialogue between the pontifical Catholic universities in North America and Latin America. And we initiated something, and it was very stimulating and brought in people from many different disciplines. And then I had the privilege, some years later, being invited by Michael Budde and colleagues at DePaul, partly under the inspiration and hard work of Michael Budde before I came there, working on the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology. And it was a great privilege, but we worked on many issues in the global church, but in particular, we made trips to Mexico and Brazil and did conferences trying to realize this vision of one church in North America and Latin America. And he's not here with us today, but Father Robert Pelton, CSC, is a young man, whippersnapper, as I call him. He's just 90, almost 97 years old. And he was a missionary priest in Chile and worked hard in El Salvador and in Panama. And he established here at Notre Dame, on the basis of his missionary efforts, a project that focuses on reverse mission, taking the fruits of missionary work in Latin America and bringing it here to North America for theological reflection. And that's what we call Latin American, North American Church Concerns. So each of these efforts, Catholic University, DePaul, and Notre Dame, that I just mentioned, are incarnations or realizations of what John Paul II himself tried to inspire us to do in Ecclesia in America. And Dr. Maria Clara Bingemer, whom I'll introduce in just 1 minute, will also be the host of a similar event in Rio de Janeiro this fall to carry forward that vision. Just one word about the content of the exhortation, just kind of following in line with what I just said, even though I think our speakers will address it more fully and better than I can. But at the time when it came out in 1999, I was inspired to write something that was entitled, and I cite from the encyclical Social Solidarity as a Fruit of Trinitarian Communion. And that's a principle that John Paul II put forward in the apostolic exhortation, trying to link the social mission of the church to the Trinitarian mystery of God. And I don't want to go into that, what I said then. I think what I would say now would be a little different than what I said in 1999. Things have changed in the church. The pontificate of Pope Francis in some ways has made it easier, in some ways it's brought in new challenges, in some ways we have challenges of our own making to address. My colleague Todd Walaka recently published a book, 2017, with the Catholic University of America Press called From Balthasar and the Option for the Poor, Theodramatics in the Light of Liberation Theology, which gives, I think, one account of how to think about principles like social solidarity in relationship to Trinitarian communion. I mean, how does the idea of God then relate to social justice and action on behalf of the poor? So I just wanted to flag that as one of the very many possible, very fruitful themes for theological reflection, for reflection within the church that struck me then as important and struck me now as important. The last thing I want to say before introducing our speakers, it's a large topic and I'm just going to hint at it, is that we had a windfall recently, and I want to tell you about it, particularly undergraduates or graduate students who are interested in doing a research project. You might be able to follow up on this. But I got a call in, so the exhortation was published in January, and I got a call in the summer from a guy who was the new chair of the Department of Theology here at the University of Notre Dame. And he said that they had a conference in mind. And the guy who called me was Professor John Cavadini, and he was new to being chair at Notre Dame, and kind of his inaugural event would be a conference that was entitled Building the Civilization of Love, Imagining the Third Millennium. He put it together with Don McNeil, the former director of the Center for Social Concerns, and Father Virgilio Elizondo. And then a book publication was planned and it never was published. But I wanted to say a word about it because it goes directly to our theme today. This amazing conference. The funny thing about it was that I was then at the Catholic University of America, was a very different institution in terms of means than this one. And I said to John, well, I'll be in Rome because I'd recently got married and moved to Rome. I can't come to your conference. He said, no, this is Notre Dame and don't worry about it. And we'll bring you there. I was like, that's a different place than I was used to. And look at where things are now. But at any rate, John put together this amazing conference, and I did want to say something about it. I can't go through the whole list. And also I want to thank Father Dan Grudy, CSC, who had these archives in his computer, and they've been just sitting there. But the president of the Argentine, Stanislao Carlish, Argentine Bishops' Conference was here. The chair of the Brazilian Bishops' Conference at the time was Demetrio Valentini. Bishop Ricardo Ramirez from Las Cruces, New Mexico. Our own Matt Ashley spoke. The late Lorenzo Albacete, you might not have known him, is working on the bishops on evangelization and solidarity. If you know anything about Lorenzo Albacete, I spoke about solidarity as the fruit of communion. The president of CELAM was here. Professor Orlando Espín from the University of San Diego, talking about popular Catholicism. Jose Oscar Beozzo, Father Pelton spoke about small Christian communities. Sister Aida Ramirez, the very dear nun from Cuba, read a talk of Jaime Ortega, the recently retired cardinal from Havana. At any rate, the point is that we have these in our archives in Lanark. And if you want to study what Notre Dame did as a conference in a book that never got published, basically, they're available, and we're going to try to put them on the Hesburgh Library website. So now to the main event. It's my great pleasure to introduce two very distinguished speakers. Professor Maria Clara Bingemer was the Brazilian Fulbright Distinguished Chair in Democracy and Human Development here in the Kellogg Institute just a few years ago, and she now is in the department, and has been for some time, in the Department of Theology in the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, where she was also the chair of the, or the dean of the Center for Theology and Human Sciences. I can't go through her amazing curriculum vitae, but I will tell you a little bit about some of the recent book projects that she's done, especially the ones that you can read in English. A Face for God, Reflections on Trinitarian Theology for Our Times, was published by Convivium in 2014. I had the distinct pleasure, one of the many lovely collaborative projects I've been able to do with Professor Bingemer was a conference that was originally took place at DePaul when we had the center there, and was later published by Orbis Press, Witnessing, Prophecy, Politics, and Wisdom. That's in English. Mary, Mother of God, Mother of the Poor, she published with Yvonne Guevara in 2004 with Wittgenstock. One of her passions is the passion of Simone Weil, the great French philosopher and mystic, and her book in English we came out with Wittgenstock in 2015 is entitled Simone Weil, Mystic of Passion and Compassion. A very nice overview of her thought is Mystery and the World, Passion for God in Times of Unbelief, Wippenstock 2016. A nice overview of Latin American theology. I commend this to graduate students and to undergraduates and to MTS students, but it's a very helpful book, Latin American Theology, Roots and Branches, published with Orbis in 2016. She has two books in Portuguese that I'm going to mention in their English translation because they may be of interest to people here. They just came out in the last year or so. Thomas Merton, The Cloister in the Center of the World, and then a book on mysticism and witnessing and communion, which deals with the comparison between the Jesuit martyrs in El Salvador and the monks of Tiberine. Our second speaker is Professor Michael Budde, who was very influential in the development of the Center for World Catholicism at DePaul and has at different times been the chair, get this, the chair of the Department of Political Science, the chair of the Catholic Studies program, and also run, and at least on an interim basis, the Center for World Catholicism Intercultural Theology itself. Professor Budde is a political scientist who has written about global Catholicism from many different vantage points. His most cited book, as far as I can tell, is The Magic Kingdom of God, which looks at processes of globalization in relationship to Catholicism. He has a very important book that he edited with his colleagues at DePaul on witnessing in the global church. And in general, Professor Budde has been leading the way, in my opinion, about thinking about the politics of globalization and its economic determinants in relationship to the processes of global Catholicism. So without further ado, I'd like you to join me in welcoming our two speakers and getting this event underway. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for sharing your afternoon with me. I understand this is the last day of the semester, and that you are here shows either unusual determination or serious errors in judgment in terms of how you allocate your free time. I'm grateful that you chose to spend some time with us. The name of the title of my remarks this afternoon is called After 20 Years, John Paul II and the Search for Pan-African Catholicism. Expressions of church in America, or what you might think of as Pan-African Catholic sensibility, these exist in many forms, from the cross-training of seminarians to paired parishes, joint statements by groups of bishops on social and political issues, and perhaps most visibly in recent years, Mass and other liturgical gatherings held on both sides of the border, like, for example, at the US-Mexican border. In one of these, more than 300 people gathered with bishops from both the United States and Mexico, including Cardinal Sean O'Malley of Boston. The liturgy was an act of solidarity in opposition to the person the Los Angeles Times called the, quote, deporter-in-chief, a term used in immigration circles to refer to Barack Obama, back in 2014. More recently, some Catholic bishops have moved beyond joint statements and experimented with speaking directly to the faithful in other countries. In 2018, for example, the Mexican Bishops' Conference released a statement aimed at the Catholic community in the United States, what it called the brother country that receives Mexican migrants, reminding them that migrants are not criminals and the border should not be a war zone. I approach this assignment today with gratitude and appreciation to Peter and the work he's done and the opportunity to work with my friend and colleague Maria Clara once more. I approach this conversation prepared to find in the exhortation Ecclesia in America at least some seeds of those expressions of pan-American or transnational Catholic sensibilities that have emerged over the past 20 years. As I looked backward, I imagined, a look backward, I imagined, would be helpful as we broaden and deepen the sense of being one body of Christ across the political, racial, cultural, and other barriers that demarcate the Americas. What I found instead is that, for the most part, whatever degree of Pan-American Catholic consciousness that has found expression in the past 20 years has occurred outside of, and in some cases in spite of, the influence of Ecclesia in America. Those areas in which the notion of membership in the body of Christ has become deeper, bringing Catholics into a more substantive notion of church that is not strictly national in scope, can be better explained, I suggest, as results of trends and initiatives largely independent of the apostolic exhortation that gathers us here today. When looking forward, while it's my belief that Ecclesia in America provides only modest help in charting a path forward, it does make a contribution in the extent that it models perhaps ways not to take. Its weaknesses, some of which are more apparent after 20 years, provide us with cautions and counsels as the church moves forward in the American hemisphere. We lack time for a complete review of the document in question. I will say that I see a few major themes in the document that can be mentioned briefly. With my time, I will identify a few of these aspects that are relevant to the goal of greater ecclesial solidarity across borders in the Americas and the extent to which they help or hinder those processes. As Pope John Paul II's statement following the Synod on Evangelization, Ecclesia in America proclaims that bringing people into relationship with Christ is a call to, quote, conversion, communion, and solidarity. As he wrote, he aimed to, quote, reflect on America as a single entity by reason of all that is common to the peoples of the continent, including their shared Christian identity and their genuine attempt to strengthen the bonds of solidarity and communion between the different forms of the continent's rich cultural heritage. The decision to speak of America in the singular was an attempt to express not only the unity which in some way already exists, but also to point to that closer bond which the peoples of the continent seek and which the church wishes to foster as part of her own mission as she works to promote the communion of all in the Lord. That's from section 5 of the document. Ecclesia in America is meant as another piece in John Paul's new evangelization initiative, arguably the defining concern of his pontificate. By engaging with the Americas as a whole, the Pope intended that, as he said, as sisters and neighbors to each other, the particular churches of the continent will strengthen the bonds of cooperation and solidarity in order that the saving work of Christ may continue in the history of America with ever greater effect. Open to the unity which comes from true communion with the risen Lord, the particular churches and all who belong to them will discover through their own spiritual experience that the encounter with the living Jesus Christ is the path to conversion, communion, and solidarity. To the extent that these goals are reached, there will emerge an ever-increasing dedication to the new evangelization of America. Given all of this, the exhortation itself ranges widely across a variety of topics and concerns. The connections among them, and with the task of evangelization in the Americas, not easily discerned in all cases. We learned that two of the most important features shaping the new evangelization of the Americas are secularization, in some places and among some groups, and still existing popular forms of Christian piety and religiosity, again, in some places and among some groups. Chapter 2 of the document provides a laundry list of situations and qualities that define the encounter of peoples in the Americas with Jesus Christ. These range from the Christian identity of America, the fruits of past evangelization, popular piety, and Christian social initiatives. They include the rise of human rights and globalization, the problems of corruption and drug trafficking, and much more. The third chapter of the document describes the nature of conversion as Pope John Paul understands it, while chapters 4 and 5 outline paths to communion and solidarity. These two chapters focus on the role of bishops, clergy, and lay people in the new evangelization and why and how the church must respond to the problems of the day. The final chapter, the part of the exhortation that actually is an exhortation, calls on Catholics to proclaim the gospel anew in a variety of ways and in the face of a variety of obstacles. I note but will not explore the degree to which Ecclesia in America extends some of the defining aspects of Pope John Paul's ministry. For example, protecting and preserving the power of the Petrine office from a robust notion of collegiality, the ontologically defined nature of ordination, and his separation of the so-called sins of Christians from the sins of the church, a methodological move he employed to exempt the church from having a share of responsibility, for example, in the Rwandan genocide. Instead, I want to draw your attention to a few places where the exhortation is most in need of supplement, I would suggest. Places that, if approached differently in the future, might themselves be opportunities for encouraging the sort of transnational Catholic sensibility that the Pope described as valuable in making Jesus real to the persons of the Americas. For example, number one, there's an extensive discussion of Catholic social teaching, which someone smarter than me once described as ecclesial penicillin. Whatever the problem, apply Catholic social teaching and things get better. As it surveys the American landscape, north, central, and south, Ecclesia in America continues the tradition of offering Catholic social teaching as the cure for every and all social malady. John Paul writes, quote, "Faced with the great social problems which with different characteristics are present throughout America, Catholics know that they can find in the Church's social doctrine an answer which serves as a starting point in the search for practical solutions. Spreading this doctrine is an authentic pastoral priority." On one level, it's certainly unrealistic to expect that the Pope is going to ask hard questions about the coherence and adequacy of Catholic social teaching, given the centrality of the category in recent Catholic history, and given that it has allowed the papacy a platform and legitimacy to speak to a worldwide audience. On the other hand, Catholic social teaching has not been beyond question, even within Catholic circles for decades now. Some of the most important work being done by theologians committed to the Church and its work for justice and peace. Ecclesia in America proceeds with relative disregard for such cautions and concerns, and instead proffers social analysis of the Americas that are relatively deficient and that in many ways inhibit worthwhile ecclesial cooperation and mission. In illustrating this point, you can look at sections 55 through 65, which identify the barriers impeding the path to solidarity and plaguing the world of the peoples of the Americas. In these sections, one can see echoes of the analytical approach of Centesimus Annus in 1991. For my money, perhaps among the most disappointing of major 20th century encyclicals, based on a relative incoherence of its social analysis. Ecclesia in America, like Centesimus, offers a laundry list of problems: the drug trade, public corruption, racial discrimination, destruction of the environment, and more, without any sense that there are structures and processes that hold these together in ways that make solving them an altogether different matter than simply saying, you politicians should stop taking bribes, or you drug dealers should stop selling drugs. Centesimus lacks a coherent theory of capitalism, for example. In John Paul's hands, social analysis there consisted of creating two lists: a list of good things to advance in matters of political economy and a list of bad things to avoid. Leaders were to choose the good things and not choose the bad things, with no sense that such may well be impossible given the transnational nature of capital and its disciplining of political and other decision makers. John Paul reflects a world of unlimited powers of agency in a world in which structures and constraints on agents, on decision makers, get little more than a hand wave. In Ecclesia in America, for example, the Pope makes mention of something he calls neoliberalism, but he doesn't mention capitalism. Following Catholic social teaching means saying no to some parts of neoliberalism while leaving capitalism relatively unexplored. It's not clear that one builds Pan-American Catholic solidarity by affirming both the preferential love for the poor in section 58 and the need to show love and pastoral affection for the elites that run the world in section 67. But since individual actors have near limitless agency in the social and religious sphere, one can comfort the elites and ask them to evangelize other elites without compromising the Church's mandate to liberate, assist, and uplift the poor and anyone who has been marginalized. Similarly, it's odd that in a document calling for a shared sense of church that joins believers across the Americas, there is virtually no mention of nationalism. None. It is as if nations do not engage in their own formative processes by which people are molded into loyal citizens whose primary allegiance is to one's country or national grouping. The almost willful naivete about the church's ability to form Christians comes through in this gaping omission, even as the document as a whole can be read as a lament regarding the inability of the church to form people into discipleship worthy of the name. It goes on to explore problems regarding youth, the bugaboo of cults and sects, and the cancer of secularization. Both nationalism and capitalism are formative enterprises that shape the affections, dispositions, desires, and actions of people. And if the church is going to evangelize or form anyone in the years ahead, it will need to come to terms with the extent to which formation is always a contested process, in which Christian proclamation and nurture walk in a world in which structures of formation and socialization already exist and dominate the landscape. Second aspect that struck me as reading this, as I reread this preparing for our conversation today, I was reminded starkly, I have to confess, by what I think can only be described as the triumphalism that infuses the document. From the opening section to the end, the evangelization of the Americas is presented in a way that would probably embarrass anyone not named Steve Bannon. Section 1 rejoices in the immense gift that was the first preaching of the gospel on American soil 500 plus years ago. Section 14 sees the gospel brought by the Europeans as, quote, the greatest gift, end quote, ever given to the new world by the Lord. This immense gift has given rise to countless martyrs and witnesses to the faith and saints who are, quote, the true expression and the finest fruits of American Christian identity, end quote. Gratitude for this gift should motivate people in the Americas to strive for a deeper personal conversion and fidelity to the gospel. And in its conclusion, section 75 calls for people in America to renew their thanks for having received the gospel in 1492, quote, when America welcomed the faith. All of this is remarkable inasmuch as John Paul and the rest of the Euro-American church passed through the intense controversy of the quincentennial celebration of Columbus's 1492 arrival in the Americas. Charges of genocide or ethnic cleansing, of conquest at Swords Point, and so much more. All of this filled the air, inspiring protests, counter-programming, public statements, and more, much of this from Catholics in the Americas, not from enemies of the faith. Yet apart from a throwaway line or two about being respectful of the popular pieties of indigenous peoples and persons of African descent, and a few short paragraphs opposing discrimination against indigenous and African descended persons, the re-evangelization of the continent appears as a process building upon an original blessing to the Americas rather than perhaps a more ambiguous transmission process. The way the gospel was inserted into the New World and the depth to which it depended on conquest and slavery puts one into the realm of originating sin, perhaps, rather than founding blessing. So how might this major shortcoming in the document point toward another potentially more faithful and valuable path forward for the church in the Americas? Let me make one suggestion. One path forward in representing the gospel in the Americas, in showing how it can be good news to a world bathed in pain and oppression, is for the church to lead the region in an intensive and extensive exploration of the creation of white supremacy and the settlement of the Americas. There is not a country in the Americas that does not bear the scars of indigenous extermination and expropriation, that does not live with the legacy of racialized African slavery. These are not matters of the past best left to slumber, but in fact are powerful and ongoing monsters that plague our lands. Some people argue that the deepest commonalities across the Americas is not Christianity, but white supremacy. Even further, that the commonality of white supremacy has remade Christianity in its image, much more than Christianity has purged the continent of racial, economic, and cultural domination. We don't have time to go much into it, but for those of you looking for research programs, an exploration in the subfield of settler colonialism, which has become a more prominent multidisciplinary field in the last 25 years, is aching for substantive theological analysis. We can talk a little bit more about what that is in the question time if you're interested. But it holds together simultaneous matters of past and present in ways that the church might benefit from. That's relevant also in the sense that we are living through a time of indigenous resurgence and activism. You're probably aware of some of that, reaching from rural zones targeted by mining and mineral conglomerates through pipeline activism and water protectors in places like Standing Rock and into the halls of the United Nations. I can think of no better way to launch a new evangelization of the Americas as a joint venture of Catholics and other Christians across the hemisphere than to engage in a long-term multi-level exploration and dialogue on the legacy of the initial exploration, the initial evangelization. Pick your issue: the predations of capitalism, state and private violence targeting non-whites, targeting people in marginalized communities, the final exploitation of the ecosystem. All of them and more have roots in what's been called the original sins of the Americas. And for the Americas to have the sort of metanoia that John Paul called for in Ecclesia in America, for Christians to embody news that is both good and new in a world grown cynical of the Christian movement, a communal exercise in discernment, confession, and amendment of life would be a religious pilgrimage that could usefully cross borders and barriers en route to becoming a foretaste of the promised kingdom of God. You could do worse than start with what Pope Francis said about indigenous groups to and about indigenous groups in 2015, where he says, quote, "Here I wish to bring up an important issue. Some may rightly say, when the Pope speaks of colonialism, he overlooks certain actions of the church. I say this to you with regret. Many grave sins were committed against native peoples of America in the name of God. My predecessors acknowledged this. Selam, the Council of Latin American bishops, has said it, and I too wish to say it. Like St. John Paul II, I ask that the church, I repeat what he says, kneel before God and implore forgiveness for the past and present sins of her sons and daughters. I would also say, and here I would wish to be quite clear, I humbly ask forgiveness not only for the offenses of the church herself, but also for crimes committed against the native peoples during the so-called conquest of America." Thank you for welcoming me here today.
Good evening. Thank you, Michael, for this vibrant speech. I must say I agree with Michael, with his critics about the problem of the original peoples, the indigenous, etc. But in Latin America, we always say that if you can't absorb positively the text, you must try to absorb, to create positively the hermeneutics. That's what I'm trying to do here. I will try to highlight some points of this document of 20 years ago that seem to me important and positive. And I would criticize mostly what we as church have done with this document or not done. Because in spite of having a vision still triumphalist as it has, as Mike demonstrates so well, I think there are some points that are important, including for criticize this triumphalism. So the first one that appears as a background of the document, I think, is the Patria Grande, as your topic desired. Patria Grande we can translate for great homeland. Although the document does not use this expression, Patria Grande, we can see as a background the possibility of using this concept as a key to read it. The concept of great homeland, Patria Grande, even though it's not properly theological or totally explanatory of the path followed by the Latin American church in these more than 50 years after Medellin Conference in 1968, gathers a little of the mystic that could be created in the south of America, departing from the affinities and convergences discovered along the way. The Patria Grande is initially a political concept associated with the utopia of Ibero-America integration, rejecting the conflictive fragmentation that had occurred with the Spanish Empire in the Americas, that followed the wars of independence in Hispanic America. The term is often used to specifically meaning the projects of the Hispanic American unity realized by Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín, liberators respectively of the North and the South of Latin America. In Latin American ecclesial circles, Patria Grande began to be used mostly after Medellin's conference in 1968 to identify the continental church's awareness of being one with its own identity, its indigenous cultures. It also meant the goal of not separating the proclamation of faith from the struggle for justice. The 5 episcopal conferences of the Catholic Church in the continent, Rio de Janeiro 1955, Medellin 1968, Puebla, Mexico 1979, Santo Domingo 1992, and Aparecida 2007, are like 5 milestones that show this itinerary of the continent's church with its advances and retreats. Patria Grande is a concept that means shared homeland or community spanning all of America. More applied to Hispanic America, we can say that it was adopted ecclesially, covering Brazil and the other countries that speak other languages in the continent, including the Caribbean. Nowadays, the term begins to be applied even to the north of the continent, mainly considering the Latino populations who live in the US and in Canada, and begin to be majority of Catholics residing in the north of America. Latinos have been the key to the growth of the Catholic Church in the US. It is estimated that Hispanics make up 60% or more than 50% of Catholics under the age of 18, of whom 93% were born in the US, but through their families maintain their faith, their language, and cultural traditions. And in some ecclesial circles, there is a true desire that the dialogue between Latin Americans and the Latinos residing in the US, who are Latin Americans who came to the North searching for a better life, is increased, and the mutual differences and richnesses can be fruitfully shared. So the document, to our understanding, has some rich elements which can help to promote this unity of the continent, expressed as a desire by the Pope in the document. And I quote, "On the threshold of the 3rd Christian millennium, and at a time when many walls and ideological barriers have fallen, the Church feels absolutely duty-bound to bring into still deeper spiritual union the peoples who compose this great continent, and also prompted by the religious mission which is proper to the Church to steer among these peoples a spirit of solidarity." And he continues, "I ask that the Special Assembly of the Synod of Bishops reflect on America as a single entity, by reason of all that is common to the peoples of the continent, including their shared Christian identity and their genuine attempt to strengthen the bonds of solidarity and communion between the different forms of the continent's rich cultural heritage. The decision to speak of America, not Americas, America in the singular, was an attempt to express not only the unity, which in some way already exists, but also to point to that closer bond which the peoples of the continent seek, and which the Church wishes to foster as part of her own mission as she works to promote the communion of all in the Lord. This is the first point. The second point, which I think is positive, is the devotion to Mary. John Paul II had a great devotion by the Virgin Mary. It's undeniable that the devotion to Mary, Our Lady, is one element which is common to the whole America, even if it is obliged to denounce the Spanish and Portuguese colonizers and their oppressive and violent methods with the native peoples in the South of America. It is imperative to recognize their deep faith and fervent devotion to the Virgin Mary. Arriving to the New World, Mary will be called La Conquistadora, the conqueror. This title is highly significant because with it, Mary becomes incorporated to the whole enterprise of spiritual conquest or reconquest that the missionaries intended to realize in the domain of the New World. This Virgin Mary brought by the European to America appeared before the original people's eyes, and how was her configuration as devotion and religious symbol for them? From the indigenous perspective, that was a war between peoples and gods due to henotheistic mentality in relation to the Aztec world, as Octavio Paz, the great Mexican Nobel Prize, says. The general conscience of the original peoples was that they were in front of an invader and enemy world, protected by stranger and foreigner gods, who were also enemies. In this context, the conqueror virgin could appear to the Amerindian world as the symbol of strength, of injustice, of oppression of their enemies, and the cause of their defeats and losses in an obviously unjust war. The arrival of Mary and the devotion to her in Latin American countries was so not at all easy. Nevertheless, this has changed along the time after the arrival of the colonizers due to mainly two facts. The first is what the theologian Virgilio Elizondo states, and I quote, "It is an undeniable fact that the devotion to Mary is the characteristic of the more popular Latin American Christianity. She is present in the same origins of Christianity in the New World. Since the beginning, Mary's presence conferred dignity to the enslaved people, hope to the exploited, and motivation to all liberation movements. Also, putting aside their interpretation, it is impossible to deny the fact of the devotion to Mary." End of quote. John Paul II emphasized this devotion as part of the identity of the peoples of the whole America. He says, I quote, "Indeed, the most blessed Virgin is linked in a special way to the birth of the church in the history of the peoples of America. Through Mary, they came to encounter the Lord." And he highlights the special configuration in this general devotion to Mary, who has many names in the various countries of the continent, north and south, the concrete example of Guadalupe. "The appearance of Mary," I'm quoting the document, "to the native Juan Diego on the hill of Tepeyac had a decisive effect on evangelization. Its influence greatly overflows the boundaries of Mexico, spreading to the whole continent. America, which historically has been and still is a melting pot of peoples, has recognized in the mestiza face of the Virgin of Tepeyac, in Blessed Mary of Guadalupe, an impressive example of a perfectly enculturated evangelization. Consequently, not only in Central and South America, but in North America as well, the Virgin of Guadalupe is venerated as Queen of all Americas." End of quote. We can see here a path to think about the unity of the continent, departing from this Marial motherhood emphasized by John Paul II. Catholicism in America is very much sealed and configured by Marial devotion. And through Guadalupe, the mestizaje of ethnicities, traditions, and cultures is put at as a central element to understand the continent. I would mention that in Brazil, more important and more central than Guadalupe is the devotion to Aparecida, which is a Black virgin. So, and it is understood as the mother and the liberator of the slaves, the Afro-Brazilian slaves. And Mary and the devotion to her confirms the openness to diversity as a vocation of the continent. That devotion shows the Christian symbol together with the indigenous, and I would add with the African symbol, in the experience of the manifestation of the Virgin Mary to Juan Diego, and in Brazil to the fisherman who found the statue. And this is to be understood as the true American identity. Third point, the popular piety or popular religiosity. This is another element pointed by the document that can help to increase the unity of America as one continent. The document praises the positivity of this popular religiosity and the form it takes. I quote, "A distinctive feature of America is an intense popular piety, deeply rooted in the various nations. It is found at all levels and in all sectors of society. And it has special importance as a place of encounter with Christ for all those who, in poverty of spirit and humility of heart, are sincerely searching for God. This is more important. This piety takes many forms: pilgrimage to shrines of the Blessed Virgin, of Christ, and of the saints, prayer for the souls in purgatory, the use of sacramentals, water, oil, candles. These and other forms of popular piety are an opportunity for the faithful to encounter the living Christ. End of quote. Effectively, popular piety or religiosity is a topic that, due to its importance, has not only interested the theologians, but the magisterium itself, the bishops, etc. Closely following the Second Vatican Council, official documents and pastoral orientations in the whole America highlight the need for the Church to adapt the gospel to cultures and to adopt a pastoral pedagogy that leads people from and within their religious manifestations to a full conversion. Religion being the nucleus of the culture of a people, the religious and spiritual experience lived by the poorest and simples in the South of America and brought to the North by the migrants coming from the same South is the repository of the treasure of the values and symbols of this religiously expressed culture. Theologians like Enrique Sirio Bianchi from Argentina say that with the evolution of the process of popular piety, the manifestations of the religion of the people are no longer only seeds of the word, like Nostra Aetate, the document of the Vatican II says, but fruits of the gospel. Moreover, they are an active evangelizing force. And this evangelizing movement is connected with the struggle for liberation, affirming that the religiosity of Latin American people often becomes a claim for true liberation. Together with religious expressions emerge the values, criteria, behaviors, and attitudes that are born of popular faith and constitute the wisdom and cultural metrics of the people of the continent. In this faith, there are more than one cultural metrics. We can quote three major ones, conscious of the many subdivisions present there: the Christian European, the indigenous, and the African. The religious expressions of the people in the North and South of America are a true spirituality, a mystical experience, which is not worth anything to other expressions and even schools that have appeared in the history of Christianity. Liberation theology, Teología del Pueblo, theology of the people, and Latino theology, conscious of that, have produced many good reflections and work on this popular piety. Through that, theology recognizes that the poor live a true mysticism in the midst of so many difficult and even threatened situations of their daily life. The subject of that mysticism is, rather than collective, communitarian. It's a we, as Juan Carlos Escanone, the Argentinian philosopher and theologian, will say. Theology is called to look with respect and love to that spirituality and to drink from it, not only in taking care of the treasure that this popular religiosity means, but learning from it new ways to experience the union with God. That is the backbone of the theologian's biography and inspiration of his investigative and rigorous work. To allow oneself to be impregnated by it is imperative in the days that are running, so that theology gets closer and closer to those who are God's favorites, the poor, the vulnerable, the migrants, all those who have their lives threatened, and express that in their religious rituals and ceremonies. Another point, solidarity, a path to communion. One of the most vivid recommendations we can find in this document is the importance of solidarity. Solidarity at all levels. This is important, not only spiritual solidarity, but material, social, and spiritual. This solidarity, so strongly recommended by John Paul II, is at the same time, according to him, fruit of the communion with Jesus Christ and the way to live more and more a communion with the neighbors and the churches of the whole continent. The church in America needs to share, says the document. Christian faith must be for everyone. So everyone has to share what he or she has, possesses, is with the others. I quote, the source of a commitment to reciprocal solidarity and the sharing of the spiritual gifts and the material goods with which God has blessed them, fostering in individuals a readiness to work where they are needed. This solidarity doesn't consist of isolated gestures or attitudes of an easy benevolence. The intention of the document is to produce and promote a culture of solidarity. And this culture should not be made only of good intentions, but take concrete and efficient steps in order to reduce injustice, inequality that should not exist within the people of God, and in the continent, and in a continent that intends to be and to be considered Christian. I quote the document: "Take the gospel as its starting point. A culture of solidarity needs to be promoted, capable of inspiring timely initiatives in support of the poor and the outcast, especially refugees forced to leave their villages and lands in order to flee violence. The Church in America must encourage the international agencies of the continent to establish an economic order dominated not only by profit, but also by the pursuit of common good of nations and of the international community, the equitable distribution of goods, and the integral development of peoples," end of quote. Appealing to the Catholic social teaching with the threefold cornerstone of human dignity, solidarity, and subsidiarity, the document mentions a global solidarity which should attain all the levels, including and perhaps mainly the economical one. I quote, "The globalized economy must be analyzed in the light of the principles of social justice, respecting the preferential option for the poor, who must be allowed to take their place in such an economy, and the requirements of the international common good. For the Church social doctrine is a moral vision which aims to encourage governments, institutions, and private organizations to shape a future consonant with the dignity of every person. Within this perspective, it is possible to examine questions of external debt, internal political corruption, and discrimination both within and between nations," end of quote. In the following paragraphs, the document makes very clear that it is not a question of promote integration between nations. This is important, but much more important is, and I quote, "to cooperate with every legitimate means in reducing the negative effects of globalization, such as the domination of the powerful over the weak, especially in the economic sphere, and the loss of the values of local cultures in favor of a misconstrued homogenization." Being even more specific towards the social sins which cry to heaven because they generate violence, disrupt peace and harmony between communities within single nations, between nations, and between the different regions of the continent. Among these, the document mentions and highlights the drug trade, the recycling of illicit funds, corruption at every level, the terror of violence, the arms race, racial discrimination, inequality between social groups, and the irrational destruction of nature. The ecological problem emerged here too. Not staying in the vague and general critique, the document then touches the root of all these evils. And for me, this is the most important thing, that 20 years ago is not so evident that it was so clear as it is in the document. An iniquitous and wicked system. So the social sin is not only a personal sin, a communitarian sin, it is a structural sin, and it must be treated structurally. Then I quote, "More and more in many," and he names the system, "more and more in many countries of America, a system known as neoliberalism prevails. Based on a purely economic conception of man, this system considers profit and the law of the market as its only parameters, to the detriment of the dignity of and the respect due to individuals and peoples. At times, this system has become the ideological justification for certain attitudes and behavior in the social and political spheres, leading to the neglect of the weaker members of the society. Indeed, the poor are becoming ever more numerous, victims of specific policies and structures which are often unjust. End of quote. Theologically, this is a very important statement, as the document affirms that the preferential option for the poor is not only a preferential option for half of the continent, the southern half of it, but to the whole of it. I quote, "The Church in America must incarnate in her pastoral initiatives the solidarity of the universal church towards the poor and the outcast of every kind. Her attitude needs to be one of assistance, promotion, liberation, and fraternal openness. The goal of the church is to ensure that no one is marginalized. The memory of the dark chapters of America's history involving the practice of slavery and other situations of social discrimination must awaken a sincere desire for conversion, leading to reconciliation and communion. Concern for those most in need springs from a decision to love the poor in a special manner. In loving the poor, the Christian imitates the attitude of the Lord, who during his earthly life devoted himself with special compassion to all those in spiritual and material need." The following paragraph, still number 65, will touch some delicate and very current and contemporary issues, races and migrations. The document remembers that, I quote, "If the Church in America, in fidelity to the gospel of Christ, intends to walk the path of solidarity, she must devote special attention to those ethnic groups which even today experience discrimination, and that because all people, whatever their race or condition, have been created by God in his image. About immigrants, the document remembers that the whole America as a continent is constitutively built by immigrants. So the attitude towards those who come in always bigger numbers today must be of welcome and solidarity." I quote, "In its history, America has experienced many immigrations as waves of men and women came to its various regions in the hope of a better future. The phenomenon continues even today, especially with many people and families from Latin American countries who have moved to the northern parts of the continent to the point where in some cases they constitute a substantial part of the population. The attitude of the church towards those migrants should be positive and explicitly solidary. The document says the Church in America must be a vigilant advocate, defending against any unjust restriction the natural right of individual persons to move freely within their own nation and from one nation to another. Attention must be called to the rights of migrants and their families and to respect for their human dignity, even in cases, that's important, even in cases of non-legal immigration." End of quote. Conclusion, 20 years after, where are we? We are now celebrating 20 years of this great document, which has been a milestone in the history, not only of the church of the continent, but in all the universal church. Should we ask ourselves where we are as church in putting in practice all these recommendations? We are certainly far away for having conscience of being one America. Also, in attaining this global solidarity, the document invites us to live. Pope Francis' pontificate brought America again to the center of the debate and to the center of the church discourse. But with this, America as a whole followed the movement. Let us not forget the unforgettable speech of Pope Francis for the Congress in his visit to the US in 2015, where he treats many of the points proposed by Ecclesia in America, mostly the arms race and death penalty, among others. The dream to be a Patria Grande is still a challenge for us today as Ecclesia in America, as Church in America. Perhaps we could mention some tentatives to build a dialogue between Latin American and Latino theologians. Peter mentioned the encounter we are organizing for October in Rio de Janeiro. Those tentatives have happened, although much more discreet than it would be desirable. Let us hope they will be able to grow and open the path to concrete initiatives that would help a lot to correspond to the beautiful utopia proposed in Ecclesia in America. Thank you very much.
you hear me? So I just want to initiate a dialogue, and then before we open up the discussion, I'm very grateful for these two magnificent presentations. They were not just broad overviews, but very penetrating, very provocative, and gave us a lot to think about in terms of what was achieved 20 years ago, where it fell short, and what we have to do now. But let me, if I can, just ask each of the speakers one or two questions to get the ball rolling. So first, for Professor Budde, one of the things I omitted to mention when I made the introduction was that in 1999, he initiated something that was very interesting, and that gets to some of the things he says, I think, about the nature of the church in the light of Ecclesia in America and in light of the demands today, and that was the Ecclesia project, which is a project that brings together lay leaders, as much Protestant as Catholic, in some ways more Protestant than Catholic perhaps, and scholars. And it's a kind of grassroots church movement, which you got going. And in light of that, I wanted to have you maybe speak for a moment. We have students, undergraduate and graduate. Many are interested in Catholic social teaching and in social sciences. How do you, as a social scientist, get involved in projects that are more ethnographic, that are more qualitative, that are activist? How do you bring together your social science background and your Catholic faith?
My critics would say that I managed to find two things to do poorly rather than one thing to do well. You know, I think it's the kinds of questions that bridge all of these disciplinary fields and that I think open up ideas that are perhaps worth exploring, whether you're talking about the church globally, whether you're talking about particular local expressions of church, is to really take the kind of the multifaceted quality of ecclesiology seriously. It's a category that's simultaneously theological. What does it mean to be church? What does it mean to be the community called by God to continue and make manifest, however imperfectly, the mission of Christ on earth? And it's also sociological. Who's in, who's out, what are the criteria for membership, how is authority distributed, demographics, all those sorts of things. And if you hold those two categories simultaneously and lean on them a little bit, you find that you become an intellectual trespasser. And that's a good thing. It's not necessarily a good career move for those of you who are graduate students, but it's certainly one that allows you to sort of range and follow questions where they take you rather than running up against fences that the politics of scholarship sometimes puts forward. One of the things that has informed my work with the Ecclesia project and in some of the kind of the political economy of ecclesiology is in this idea of allegiance and identity as a common set of categories that's central both to the Christian movement and to institutions of power and authority in the so-called secular world. Who are you? Whose are you? To whom do you belong? I've been impressed by those theologians from the global south and from kind of minority traditions in the European expression of Christianity that just basically say, if you take this Jesus stuff seriously, then arguably baptism becomes a more determinative aspect of who one is, your identity, your allegiances, how you keep score in life, to whom you are connected, than the sort of the constructs of nations, the constructs of states, who have their own interest in making those seem determinative, insufficient numbers in political terms, so that people, you know, are persuaded to kill for, die for, and pay for the modern state system, for example. So those are some of the things. Very good. That, you know.
Okay, just one more. So I take let's give you a scenario. I take my baptism seriously, and I am very self-examining and reflective about my allegiance. I want to be self-critical in regard to my, say, I'm Catholic faith. But I'm also a student in the DePaul School of Commerce. And I understand what the Catholic social teaching, which sometimes seems like a penicillin, says, but I want to take the penicillin. I need it. And I want to find not just the social structures of sins, which both of you talked about very eloquently and importantly, prophetically, but I want to find some concrete project to get involved in. And I know later writers, Pope Benedict and Charity and Truth talked about economy of communion and things like that. Is there anything I can do as a Catholic capitalist, or am I doomed?
I think you're better spending your time somewhere else. You could perhaps find a more productive path for your vocation. But given that people have questions about how to provision for oneself and one's community and so on, I think those are legitimate questions. And I think those places and those communities, both inside and outside the church, that are asking questions about how do you begin to decommodify provision of needs? How do you move away from the kind of the structured incapacity of communities to maintain themselves, in a way pushes back against some of the more pernicious as well as deeply entrenched aspects of the modern economic system, which begins with taking away ability for communities to provide their own subsistence. You can't create labor markets. You can't create people willing to sell themselves to go into coal mines or diamond mines or anything awful unless you first take away their ability to feed, clothe, and shelter themselves. So to the extent that you can do that, you open up the possibility of creating, however modestly, some sort of liberated space or some sort of free space that then can ask questions about, well, what would constitute exchange in which, needs have been defined by use rather than by exchange.
Very good, thank you. Una pregunta. You talked a lot, I mean, you gave us a model for how to read Ecclesia in America with this decommodifying hermeneutic in mind, so I think that's very helpful. But one question that comes up a lot, I don't know if you've heard it, but I think you might be able to respond to it. Is liberation theology dead?
No. Gustavo Gutierrez, who is considered the father of liberation theology, he always says, they ask me if liberation theology is dead. As I'm called the father of liberation theology, I've never been to the funeral of my daughter. No, liberation theology is not dead. And he says it's not for a good reason, but perhaps for a bad reason. Poverty is not ended. So on the contrary, poverty is increased. So liberation theology is more than ever alive. And what happened to liberation theology in Latin America is that liberation theology enlarged its scope. It began with the attention with the focus on the socioeconomical political poverty. And now it treats also other topics connected to it, like gender, race, ethnicity, ecology, and religious diversity. So it enlarged its scope and its production, its reflection, but it's not that. It's alive. Mm-hmm.
One last question. So I know you spoke very beautifully about the Virgin Mary in Ecclesia in America and the importance of John Paul II, and you've written even books about thinking about Mary and Mariology in a new key. But you've also been involved in discussion about women in the church, and more recently have been lecturing on feminicide. Why? What is feminicide, and why should it matter to church leaders?
Feminicide is a category coined by a South African thinker, and she wanted to make a difference between homicide and feminicide. Feminicide is not a homicide. Feminicide is the assassination of women because of hatred of them being women. And I have been lecturing on that because in Brazil, this is growing, unfortunately. We have had many more feminicides than ever. Violence against women, domestic violence is increasing. And the configuration of this violence is that the murder lives with you, has an intimate relationship with you. It's the husband or the stepfather or the brother lives inside your house. And he was in love with you some days ago, and now he wants to kill you, perhaps because you want to finish the relationship, and he doesn't accept that, or for jealousy or other motives. So it is a violence perpetrated in the domestic space, but that goes to the public space because, well, the conscience of being this violence is increasing also. We have a president that doesn't help a lot with that. He is very unrespectful and completely disregarding the dignity of women. I say that because he says things publicly. He has been a deputy for 27 years. During those 27 years, he approved 3 projects, so very efficient, as you can see. One day, in a discussion with a colleague, a woman deputy also in the Congress, he told her, "I don't rape you because you don't deserve. You are very ugly." So he's a man like that. And some days ago, he made a declaration that those who want to come to Brazil to have sex with a woman, be at ease. But we don't want gay tourism here. So it's a man with distorted ideas and with a very bad view of what are women and the relationship you have to have with them. The positive thing is that his presence and his running for presidency increased the movement of women in Brazil. So, but still the violence and the feminicide is happening very frequently and very sadly in Brazil. Also in other countries of Latin America. I don't know here how are the statistics, but well, in our country is a tragedy, really.
Nancy Pineda Madrid, of course, has written on that as well. Please, the floor is open for any questions you may have. One at a time, please. One at a time. Please, Todd.
I have a question.
Have a microphone.
Maybe it's good if you use the microphone just because we're recording.
So I have a couple questions for Michael in relation to your comments on sort of the failures of the document. And so I was rereading it today before coming here, and it struck me some of the same things. Even when racism comes in, it's very late, fairly short. And so I was wondering, the first question is sort of why the lack of recognition of the role of conquest of white supremacy as sort of an enduring challenge to America? Is it a failure of imagination, a failure to see? Is it a failure to recognize the way sin functions or the depth of sin? Is it maybe knowing that it would be offensive to many people to lay that out? So sort of why? And then the second question is, if the problem is not that we kind of fail to obey teachings, right? Because if that were the problem, then you just give the teachings. If the problem is we've been sort of habituated in a deformative way by culture, by structures, then what's sort of the practical way forward? I mean, it's sort of Peter's question, to the hypothetical student. But like, what would be that way forward?
In terms of your first question, that's the theological sort of hornet's nest of trying to engage, how and in what sense one tries to simultaneously talk about race, talk about indigenous peoples, talking about conquest and so on. Several of the things that you mentioned are absolutely on target. I wouldn't presume to know the mind of Pope St. John Paul, but I think at least part of what comes through in some of the ecclesial stuff from his generation in part kind of a holdover from Reformation polemic. The idea that you know, the colonization of Catholic parts of the Americas was qualitatively different than the Protestant parts of the North, and so on. Settler colonialism, the idea of sort of not just inserting, you know, settlers from abroad, but clearing out and exterminating an indigenous population and then building anew using African labor, was often thought of as being predominantly related to the English-speaking colonial system. So the United States, Canada, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, and so on. And that somehow the Hispanic settlement of the Americas was somehow more benign, that, you know, it was not as catastrophic in its, you know, extermination effects, that the reality of intermarriage was somehow a more positive thing. I think not wanting to give ground on that, at least for several decades, inhibited some of the questions that, you know, might more fruitfully be asked, that some later Latin American scholars have started to put forward about, you know, the extent to which many regions in Latin America show settler colonial dynamics themselves, white-only immigration policies, sort of disenfranchising whites who married indigenous people or who married Africans, you know, losing citizenship rights as a result of that kind of a thing. As far as the second of your questions go, it's dated now, but about 20-some years ago, I wrote a book on the political economy of culture industries and how the church situates with that. And it's, you know, as of, you know, in the generation before the internet, before social media, the amount of time and attention that all of us spend engaged in, you know, matters from, about, and with for-profit culture industries is astronomical. It's gotten more intensive and more expansive since then. And, you know, you can learn or become almost anything with enough investment of time and attention. Most Catholic Christians in the United States read no books, no magazines. They, you know, if church attendance is a measurement of engagement, 30% on a good day. In some ways, it's not so, the wonderment isn't so much why has been the formation of Christian sensibilities and dispositions, you know, why hasn't it been better, but how in the face of this kind of allocation of time and attention, it's not worse. And I think moving against that requires a degree of intentionality that I think requires people to become anthropologists of their own communities and say, you know, what do we privilege, what do we prioritize, who commands our attention, where do we invest, you know, the limited amount of passion, conviction, and attention that we bring to a 24-hour day. And you can't solve that by yourself. That's a losing proposition. You can't read yourself out of this one. So.
Can I ask something to Michael? I don't know if I understood you well, but you agree with that the Spanish and Portuguese colonization was softer than the English? No, you don't agree.
No, I don't. But I think that was some of the historiography and some of the theology that you know tried to make distinctions. That of course, you know, the English bastards up in the north were awful because, you know, everything from blood quantum laws to laws against miscegenation had these raging gulfs that at least, you know, in other parts of the Americas were kinder and gentler.
It's enough to go to the central plaza of the capital of Mexico, and you see the cathedral built over the Aztec temple.
Right.
And so the symbolic violence is so clear. No?
Any undergraduate questions? Don't be shy. No, not at this moment. I was going to mention before anything else that Steve Batten, who's here with us, and I did a seminar this semester on decolonial theory and theology. And Steve also is an expert on theories and theology of the church. Did you want to add anything to this discussion? You've been working in the same field in some way.
Why don't you come take my chair and I'll sit back there.
Well, I don't really have much to add. I was listening closely, and I heard an echo of some of the things that I do teach in a course called Church and Empire, in terms of the intersection of theology and sociology relative to ecclesiology, and the fact that you do have to, when you're dealing with ecclesiology, engage the reality of the insider, outsider, us, them, sort of dynamics that's going to be a part of any social group. And that can play out in a peaceful way, us and them, or us versus them, or us over them. And so that's one of the things that I've tried to explore ecclesiologically. And I mean, one of the things that I was wondering about in terms of I guess it's a question I was just planning on maybe asking you after the talk, but the settler colonialism studies, you said that there was a need for a sort of theological voice within that discussion. But one thing I would be interested in, but perhaps afterwards, which thinkers, which authors, which publishers you're looking at in terms of that conversation, and who, if any, theologians have been participating in that. It sounds like maybe there are some, but maybe not many. And so I'd be interested in hearing more about that as well.
No, certainly be glad to talk about that later. I think one of the interesting things that some of those conversations have done is to raise some new ways to think about some sort of long-term Catholic ideas and convictions about immigration, for example. I mean, it's true that across the world, the church has been a long-term supporter of the right of movement and the right of people to relocate regardless of legal restrictions and so on. And the way in which the United States Catholic Church tells the story of itself about European immigrants and about even immigrants from elsewhere is getting restructured in some interesting questions about the extent to which land usage patterns in the early United States built upon the idea of recruiting white immigrants from across Europe precisely to sort of provide the shock troops of settlement. Once you got beyond the line of 1763, it wasn't simply the poor, the tired, huddled masses being pushed. It was also that they were being deployed in a strategic way to provide the right kind of people to populate lands that you wanted cleared out. And that's a both interesting and really provocative set of questions about how we tell the story about the immigrant church from Europe or from the rest of the Americas.
So we'll give the last word to Brazil.
Well, I want to thank the opportunity to learn a little bit more from this part of America theology, and Well, about the colonialism, I think this is becoming more and more important in the Latin American theology. It has not been since some years ago, but now it's becoming more and more important. Our Society of Theology, SOTER, is the second of the world. The first is the CTSA, and the second is ours. It's mostly Catholic, but it's ecumenical. And the topic of this year assembly will be exactly colonialism, post-colonialism, decoloniality, and we will have speakers we will have Boaventura Santos, who is a Portuguese sociologist who thinks a lot about that, and also Juan José Tamayo, who is a Spanish, and also the Mexican Carlos Mendoza Alvarez as well. It is a very hot topic in this moment. So this is my last word. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. I really appreciate your listening to us, and I want you to please join me in thanking our really wonderful speakers today.